Today's reading is from Hebrews 13, it's verses 10 to 16. So here we go. We have an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burnt outside the camp. And so, Jesus also suffered outside the city gates to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased.
I know Tim's got a real heart for the youth and identifies very well with them. Between the services, Bex asked him to make the second announcement shorter, so of course he made it longer. But we really are blessed to have him as our youth leader, and it's just been wonderful to see how it's grown over the time he's been involved. It's strange what we remember and what we don't remember from our lives. As a teenager, I often spent 3 or maybe even more hours a night doing homework. Looking back, there's a part of me that thinks that was complete madness. There's another part of me that is grateful that homework and also sport kept me from exploring less wholesome activities. I had a desk by my bedroom window, and that's where I sat and worked. Who knows how many hours I spent there, but for all those hours, I only remember one thing all these years later. I guess the window was open the night a girl walked past. She looked up at me and said to her mate something like, "Look at him up there working." I don't think she meant anything bad by that. Almost certainly she forgot what she'd said within minutes. So why is it that I remember that nearly 50 years later? Well, there was something either in what she said or how she said it that made me feel like I was in a different world. Gave me a feeling of being separate. And it resonated with feelings that I, and I guess many teenagers have, of being different to others. And I didn't like it. I look back now, and the truth is that I'm grateful that in some way I was separated from the life of the street. The Bible, including this passage and the verses Tony touched on last week, actually has a lot to say about being separate. And if I'm honest with you, I've got conflicted feelings about that. As we'll see through the course of this talk, I'm not the only person. Separation is at the very heart of the gospel. Our sin separates us from God. Thanks be to God, Jesus separates us from the consequences of our sin. In doing so, he's made us, in one sense, holy. Pages mixed up. You likely know that the word holy means to be separate or to be set apart. It's a key concept in the Bible, and in the Old Testament, being separate often had a physical expression. You see that in Leviticus 15, verse 31, says this: You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. In the historical books, the Old Testament tell of a people that lurched one way and then the other in their response to that command and others like it. When we look back now at that history through the eyes of our culture, I guess many of us have conflicted feelings as we see that separation those people were called to often required a separation of cultures and a physical separation of people, and it was often played out brutally on the battlefield. The first readers, the first hearers of Hebrews likely knew much better than most of us what it was like to live in a world of scarcity, where much in life was a battle for survival. And because of that, it's likely that they accepted much that is written in the Old Testament without the questions that come tumbling into many of our heads. Yet some of them still had conflicted feelings about separation. We've seen over the last few months that the writer of Hebrews spent 12 chapters clearly laying down some of the differences between the religion that these people had grown up with and the teaching of the church in the light of Jesus' death and resurrection. The writer made it clear there was a clear choice between two very separate paths, and they were calling the Hebrews to be separate. I suspect many of them understood very well the differences between the old and the new ways, and that in their minds they had genuinely chosen to follow Jesus. And yet in their hearts there was something pulling them back to the old ways that they were familiar with. It may have been, for many of them, Orthodox Judaism that was pulling them back. For others it was a slightly twisted variation of the teaching that they'd grown up with. And Tony spoke of that last week. When you're speaking to someone's mind, when you're trying to convince them of something, you have to be clear in what you say. And the writer's done that. I think there's now a need to speak to the heart. When you want to read someone's heart, it helps to speak to the culture, the person that is listening to you. You know, if your eyes glazed over some when today's passage was read, and I admit that's how I felt when I first read this passage, it may be because it's not written to your culture. You know, these words were heart words spoken to a culture that we're not part of. I think because of that, it's easy for us to walk past them without feeling what the original hearers would have felt. So I want us to dig into this psalm and feel some of the emotion that may have been there for those original hearers. Start with this verse. We have an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. Who on earth, in this world, in this room today, cares who has the right to eat from an altar? It doesn't matter to us anymore. Well, at that time, there was a really marked separation between the priests and most everyone else. Most everyone else struggled through life doing hard, brutal, physical work, like growing crops and caring for animals. long before the days of tractors and trucks that moved animals around. Most everyone else then had to take the very best of the animals that they had cared for with their very lives. They had to take them to the priest. The priest slaughtered them on the altar. And then the priest, and the priest alone, had the right to eat the meat. Except not on one day. Not on the Day of Atonement. Not on the day when the people sought to make amends for their sins. On that day, no one is allowed to eat the sacrifice. The bodies of the animals were taken outside the camp. And that choice meat was burnt to a cinder. Now, I don't know if the people resented the priests when they ate the choice meat. I feel resentful on their behalf, telling me that I have an altar from which I have no right to eat. Sorry, I have an altar from which they have no right to eat. Spins around the separation between me and the priest. And it makes me feel good. Now the separation we're talking about, that I need to leave the old traditions, now it works in my favour because I get to eat from the altar. And that makes it easier for me to pull away. The trouble is, I stand back from that a little. That's where I start to feel conflicted. There's an anger that burns in me when the priests act like they're better than others. But when I have my own special altar, am I becoming just like them? As humans have this incredible ability to twist everything. In this case, to twist biblical separation so that it becomes something about elitism and privilege, about us being better than others. And as I talk about the importance of separation, I want us to be careful of our hearts. I want us to balance what I'm saying with these words, which are written in Philippians 2, verse 3 to 4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. Many of us will know that Jesus had some strong and critical words to say to the priests of his time. We need to guard our hearts so that we don't become like us, so that we're not the people looking down on others. So, having checked our hearts, let's move on to verse 11 through 13. The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. There's something about my heart that I sense a defiance in those verses that appeals to me. I have to confess that by nature I just love the thought of sticking my finger up at authority. Now that's not great, but it does help me to warm to these verses. If you're blessed, as I trust many of you are, with a more honourable character than me, you may not see any defiance here. But to me, walking with Jesus to the unclean place and bearing his disgrace is proclaiming my allegiance to him in a way that undermines the authority of those priests. And I love it. I personally could do that kind of separation all day long. And there's this verse about a city. For here, we do not have an enduring city, but we're looking for the city that is to come. It's not uncommon for people in our time, including sometimes Christians, to portray the countryside as a place of beauty and wholesomeness, and the city as an ugly place full of sin. Don't see it that way, but more to the point, back in those days, the country was where the wild things lived. Yet how would you feel about the countryside if you knew it was a place full of lions and bears and wolves, and most dangerous of all, foreign raiders looking to steal from you the things that you value most? Why do you think that the walls of ancient cities were so important? They made cities places of safety, the places to run to when there was danger. And break away, move away from the city wall at your risk. I guess a city, and especially its walls, could appear permanent. Well, history has shown us that they never are. It's like these people knew that as well as we do. But when you're standing by something as immense and strong as a city wall, you may be needing reminding that it won't be there forever. Here, we do not have an enduring city. That little reminder just kicks away a little of what holds us to where we are. And then the writer holds out the city that is to come, the New Jerusalem. If you don't know what that is, maybe go read Revelation 21 later. See, there's a battle in our hearts when we need to break away or separate from something. I believe these verses are partly speaking to that battle and that struggle. You know, it's common to have conflicted feelings as we struggle to separate from that which holds us back. It's important we have verses that speak into those circumstances. What does separation look like for us? What is it we need to separate from? Come back to that in a moment, but it's often easier to answer a question like that for other people rather than for ourselves. What is clear is that some of the people who first read or heard this book of Hebrews were struggling to break from Jewish traditions and from offshoots of those traditions that had a peculiar emphasis on ceremonial foods. That's alien to us, but that's what they needed to separate from. There are many examples in the Bible of separation. In the Old Testament, people were very often distinct from the people around them, what God's people were. And the reality is, it could come at a cost. Listen to these words in Esther, chapter 3, verses 8 to 9. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's law. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them." We could choose to dress differently to those around us. could build our homes differently, we could eat different foods, we could even speak a different language. I don't believe that is what we are called to do. And I actually don't think it's the solution that it appears to be. You know, you can appear and make yourself look very different on the outside, and yet inside be just the same as everybody else. Believe we're called to a separation that is more internal than external. Believe we need to hold lightly to the culture in which we live and break from it completely in some areas. It's true of these people in Hebrews, but it was a different culture that they had to break from. But there are also things in our very nature from which we need to break. Sometimes things that have come down through our families, through generations. That could be pride, or addiction, or apathy, or any other of the selfish paths our stubborn hearts choose to take us on. You know, those verses from Esther from a different world. Let's just go to the New Testament. Look at how it challenges us to be separate. Reading from 1 John, chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever.
Forever.
Yep, amen to living forever. But there is a part of me that stubbornly insists on loving this world. Yeah, that's my struggle. And my guess is that others in this world, in this room, that identify with that. And what other examples does the Bible give us separation? Okay, what about someone living in a very antagonistic culture where they have a huge amount to lose if they chose to be separate? The first thought was of Daniel, because we named our first daughter Danielle, because Daniel separated from the world. But instead of Daniel, I want us to stay in Hebrews and look at chapter 11, verses 24 to 27. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. That's a good story. They're not all so good. What about someone being pulled into a culture because aspects of it were deeply attractive to him, and he was unable to find freedom from it? This example from 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 to 6 doesn't end well. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women beside Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molesh, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. I don't say this lightly, but detestable is an understatement for Molesh. Yet that's where Solomon found himself. Separation isn't easy. We are, as humans, built to be loyal to those around us and to those things which are familiar to us. That loyalty isn't wrong. It helps us to stay together. Helps us to cope with one another when we feel like those around us aren't as perfect as we are, or they feel that about us. That loyalty is part of what enables us to love each other. As a child, I watched images of the Apollo rockets leaving Earth and heading for the moon. Those astronauts were my superheroes. They were strapped in this small capsule on this humongous tank of high explosive fuel. I guess they try not to think about it too much. Those massive objects took enormous energy to move. The first few moments of separation from the earth, everything moves so slowly. It's almost painful. And those are the moments of greatest risk, when everything literally could blow apart. Once or twice it did. The further the rocket moved from the earth, greater the separation, the quicker it became and the safer it became. The separation isn't easy. But actually, although those images, those pictures were really exciting to me as a young child, I marvelled at them. Those rockets were actually leaving a planet teeming with life and going to a place completely lacking in life. They always were going to come back if they could. You see, separation of itself isn't a good thing. And too often, people go from where they're supposed to be to where they shouldn't be. And when you do that, something of the life of God in us dies. We really need wisdom to get the balance right between when we should remain loyal and when we should separate. Now, on this occasion, the writer of Hebrews has rightly come down on the side of separation. Like an Apollo rocket, we've been moved slowly away from the ground. Now the writer wants to firmly turn our eyes away from where we've come. Get us to look to where we're going. Verse 15. Through Jesus, therefore let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Now, this passage uses the language of altars and sacrifice because that's something that would be familiar to these people. Now, lots of us here know in our heads at least what sacrifice was and what it meant in the Old and New Testament. But we just don't have the same connection to the altar and to the animals and to the blood that they did. It's kind of hard for us to imagine that a sacrifice could be a dramatic, an exciting event, that you'd put your best clothes on, that there'd be songs that you're familiar with ringing round in your head, that you'd be going in a crowd. But these people would have got that. Now, yes, it's hard to separate, but look at what we are joining. We are connecting with God in a way that's almost unimaginable. We sang earlier that we are a friend of God. How should we respond to that? According to this passage, with a sacrifice of praise. My first thought, and I guess this is a traditional interpretation, is that means praise or worship. Yeah, it means being alone or with people like you good selves, and speaking or singing, if you remember doing that, praise to God. When I read this verse, I wasn't so sure. Because it says the fruits of lips that openly profess his name. Just felt like a sacrifice of praise isn't necessarily what we call praise and worship. But actually it's about proclaiming Jesus to those that don't know him. I think I'll go with a compromise and say it probably means both. But if I'm right, there's a challenge here. I was hoping that having spoken of separation, that this writer would then encourage me by offering me something attractive to draw me in. And they've done that, but then they've taken a bit away from me by saying I need to proclaim that to others. You see, the reality is that we're not here for an easy life. Knowing God in this way is an unbelievable privilege. It also brings responsibility to care for those around us. The next verse is a little easier. Do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. You know, when we truly separate ourselves from those things that bind us, and then when we take hold of all that God offers us, many of us experience a transformation in the relationships that we have with one another. A glorious, wonderful transformation. Again, that's not just a privilege. It's not just about us receiving the love of others. It brings responsibility. We need to show love to others. You know, our old nature will focus on what we receive, what we can get. You know, we need to bring our new nature to bear, that we should focus on what we can give, and what love we can show. The writer calls us to do good. Doing good has a bit of a bad name because people think of it as interfering. Just take those words literally. Do good. You know, there can never, ever be anything bad about that. It's my hope and my desire that the world in which I live is a better place for me being here. For that to happen, I must do good. Sometimes that means getting involved in big battles. But most of the time, it's nothing to do with that. Most of the time, it's the little things. You know, doing good can be as simple as a smile that lights up someone else's day for a few seconds. I've long realised that God didn't make my face for smiling. So I have to find other ways to do good. Just give one example. I remember being taught as a child that if you borrowed something, you should aim to return it in a better condition than when you received it. I'll actually go further than that and say, if you visit a place, you should leave it in a better place, in a better condition, than when you found it. For that reason, when I walk on a beach, I often pick litter as I go. That's just one thing that I do. But just imagine if we wrote down what all of us together have done in the last week to make the world a better place. I actually think it would be a truly remarkable list and something for us to celebrate. So let's live every week, every day, adding things to that list. Because it says here, with such sacrifices, God is pleased. You know, we started today with the altar. It feels appropriate that we should finish with the final words of this passage. With such sacrifices, God is pleased.